Okay, so that's the substance. And I just want to share a few tips, again, from the perspective of someone who researches in education and works in education, that might lead to even better reporting than the good things that I'm seeing. So one, we've talked about before. Remember to use the dual lens of access and quality. How will a program affect children's access to education, and how will it affect how effectively they learn? A second is to think, again, recapping, beyond the direct players, who's affected. So if the program directly affects children, how does that affect teachers indirectly? Or if it directly affects school directors, what implications does that have for teachers and students and parents? So as I looked through coverage of education across African newspapers, one of the things that I saw was a lot of coverage of speeches and conferences. And so, for example, you can see this from just a few days ago. The vice president talked about how teaching methods in Nigeria are obsolete, and that's why learning outcomes aren't as strong as we want. A former president of Ghana giving a speech about how Ghana's education system really needs regular review to improve its quality. So in some ways, it's tempting to always report on speeches because they're right there. The government officials share the transcripts. They have these high-level events and they invite journalists. And it's important to do that. It's important to see what leaders in a country are saying about education and what they're proposing to do about education. So it's very important to include this kind of coverage. But at the same time, we should make sure that we balance our reporting with what else to report on. So new education policies, new programs from government or non-government organizations, and new studies of programs in your country. So like I mentioned before, there's a constant stream of these impact evaluations that are coming out, whether they're done by the World Bank or the Poverty Action Lab, or academics or researchers there within your own country. And giving coverage to that can provide really valuable balance to the coverage of the speeches and conferences, which are also important to hit. Another tip is to complement reporting with real data. So when we report on whether it's a speech or an intervention, we can draw on real data about education in these countries. And there are a lot of these data available. So for example, the World Bank has World Development Indicators. When I was preparing this presentation, the numbers that I pulled up on access and the private school situation all came directly from the World Development Indicators. Those are freely available to anyone, and they can be downloaded in a matter of minutes. There's a similar set of indicators for many African countries from the demographic and health surveys. For neither of these do you need to be an expert in education or in education statistics to bring a few simple statistics about the context of education in your country. Now, there are also local surveys in different countries. So there's an Uwezo survey in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda that specifically measures early grade reading for students. There are household surveys. And at the same time, as I mentioned before, there are these service delivery indicators surveys that have been done in many African countries and capture a whole range of educational outcomes. And so whatever we're reporting on, adding a little bit of contextual data to say, well, where are we right now in terms of access? And where are we in terms of learning? And how can we complement what we know about a new program with where we're starting from? So a related tip to that, I'll just say a couple other resources on that. I've put here, there are annual reports like the Global Education Monitoring Report that have a lot of data. For example, I put this figure here about how across a number of countries, how many primary school students have personal copies of textbooks. These are data you might not easily access, but this report comes out every year and has a lot of good evidence on African education. The Education Commission just came out with a report that's more of a one-time that provided the statistic below that across sub-Saharan Africa, just 0.3% of education budgets, not of the whole budget, just the education budget, is spent on pre-primary education. Chris mentioned early on that I'm working on the World Development Report on Education from the World Bank, which won't come out till next year. And then there are constant regional studies coming out from the World Bank and other organizations. So one that I drew on earlier in this presentation is on mathematics education in sub-Saharan Africa that I've looked through for a lot of really good background data on mathematics performance and attitudes across the continent. So a complement to that point about making sure that we report with data is to complement reporting with evidence of impact. So for example, in Tanzania, the government is in the midst of scaling up a major cash transfer initiative with conditions on whether children stay in school. Well, when reporting on that, one could highlight that there was a pilot of that initiative there in Tanzania that actually tested what impact it had on children's schooling. And as you can see, the program led to, for example, a 15 percentage point increase in the children who have completed primary school by age 15 to 18. So we actually have evidence in that case that could complement the reporting on this new program beyond our speculation of what impacts it might have. So where do you find this kind of evidence? So one is to check reviews of evidence. So we've compiled, for example, a database of education studies that highlights, that brings together a lot of these reviews of all the evidence. So often when I'm looking at a new topic, I'll open up these reviews and just search for the country that I'm working on. You can also just search for impact evaluations together with the kind of program you're reporting on, whether it's class size reductions or contract teachers or computer-assisted learning. The last tip is to remember that education is about people and not just programs. Education is about learners, and researchers like me are best suited to look at the numbers. But journalists have a unique opportunity to make data and statistics come alive with the stories of students and teachers and their families. Very few people are moved to action by statistics. They are moved by stories. So getting these stories and reporting them is a valuable service that essentially only journalists provide. Now, it's important to choose stories that demonstrate the truth about programs. And so, for example, if we have an evaluation of a program that shows that 90% of students failed to benefit, it doesn't make sense to dedicate the whole of an article for the stories of those few students who did benefit. We want to make sure the stories we tell are actually backed up by the broad truth of what's going on in the program. But together, the stories and the statistics can both motivate evidence-based policy making and spur people to action. The same thing is true when we report on studies. So if you find some new report or some new study on education, we can ask, who are the researchers? Why do they ask this question? Am I getting their results right? The vast majority of researchers have websites with their contact information, and frankly, every education researcher I know is desperate for their evidence to make it into the media to get their results out to the public. They want to talk with you. And so with reaching out, often it's not too hard to track them down. I often get reached out to by journalists from around the world when they're reporting on issues, and I'm always excited to share the evidence that I'm producing and my colleagues are producing to improve the quality of education in Africa.